showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Bets are off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
All right, good evening, everybody. Hello, hello. Are we all ready for another chapter from The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture? I hope so, because that's what we're doing. Gonna read one. Got to get the specs out here, though. All right. The captions are working, and yeah. All right. So, jumping right on in. Settle back in for a bit here. All right. Center myself in the picture there. All right. So we are on chapter 11, where this is the second chapter in the third part of the book, third and final part of the book. So let's just jump right on in. Religious sources of anti-slavery thought. The man of feeling in the best of worlds. All right. Although the Quakers' particular needs and beliefs may help explain their growing uneasiness over Negro slavery, we should not forget that the Society of Friends was a product of British Protestantism, and that most of the early non-Quaker opponents of slavery were devout British Protestants. Were there then broader developments in British religion which tended to change men's perception of human bondage? Were there more general counterparts to the Quakers' belief in the continuing inward revelation of truth, and to their need for preserving the purity of testimony in the face of a rapidly changing society? The simplest explanation is that anti-slavery was an extension of a noble philanthropic tradition. In its history, British Protestantism was forced to adjust traditional Christian doctrines to meet problems raised by enclosure, an uprooted peasantry, urban growth, and new forms of poverty. The disintegration of medieval patterns of charity and social responsibility led, even in the 16th century, to a spectacular rise of private philanthropy, which received the warm encouragement of the clergy. It was not that... excuse me. All of a sudden, a very distracting itch. It was not that bequests for education or hospitals earned merits for eventual salvation. Rather, as William Ames said, one could not love God without showing charity towards one's neighbors. The new ideal of individual responsibility appealed particularly to the merchant elite who, though lacking inherited status, could at least prove their moral worth by increasing the security or opportunities of the less fortunate. All right, I've got to stop for a second. That is going to drive me nuts. All right, I don't know what it is that's bugging me so much, but it's just itching like crazy there. All right, but it's gone now. Uh, in the 17th century, such aspirations stimulated a prodigious growth of private and institutionalized philanthropy, and some historians have reasonably concluded that anti slavery was simply a late product of this expanding spirit of benevolence, which turned inevitably from local good works to free the suffering slave. There were doubtless there were doubtless continuities of various kinds between traditional domestic philanthropy and the anti-slavery movement, but the theory that abolitionism was the natural outgrowth of a continuously swelling social consciousness fails to explain the long period when Negro slavery aroused virtually no protest and was accepted or regarded with indifference by the most benevolent of men. Britain's great expansion of the slave trade was not mitigated by centuries of developing domestic philanthropy, nor could intelligent men plead ignorance of a form of commerce and labor so central to the imperial economy. The philanthropy theory does not account for the continuing tendency to associate bondage with legitimate subordination and social discipline, or for the sudden indignation and crusading fervor of abolitionists in the 1780s and 1790s, who even then met an equally passionate resistance. The mainstream of traditional philanthropy would seem to have flowed less into anti-slavery than into the missionary efforts of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which presupposed the compatibility of temporal bondage and spiritual freedom. Even such wow, sorry. My mouth will catch up with my brain here eventually, or vice versa. Even such potentially radical sects as the Baptists showed little indication of allowing charity to infringe on the rights of property or the apparent ordinance of God. In 1711, for example, when some South Carolina Baptists requested advice from their English brethren concerning a fellow member who, in compliance with a law respecting habitual runaways, had castrated his Negro slave, they were told that they should not risk dissension over light or indifferent causes. "Quote unquote, light or indifferent causes." The English Baptists affirmed that since slavery was authorized by Scripture, was part of the governing structure of the world, and could not be maintained without social discipline, the law was a rational necessity, and the master was innocent of crime. There is no reason to think that such views would have disturbed the kindly men of the same period who left fortunes for hospitals or the support of orphans. But this very respect for property and social order suggests a possible alternative to the theory of continuously expanding benevolence. British philanthropy as one of the expressions of an emerging capitalistic ethic embodied the values of individual effort and responsibility. Yet if philanthropists went too far in their attempts to widen opportunities and promote self-reliance at home, they would undermine not only the old regime but the prevailing justifications for inequality and social rank. They might, however, experiment with liberal values by focusing their attention on a distant symbol of patriarchal society. We have seen that even in the 18th century, British clergymen, as well as colonial planters, rationalized slavery by invoking the ancient idea of a patriarchal family in which the master's authority and the servant's subordination were softened by Christian love. An attack on colonial slaveholders would also be a repudiation of prescriptive authority and paternalistic responsibility. It is conceivable that the image of feudal servitude, which long lent sanction to colonial slavery, became in time a hidden liability. Moreover, British philanthropy was at once an expression of the capitalistic ethic and a moral response to problems created by economic change. And here again, domestic philanthropists could not move beyond certain limits in aiding the victims of social upheaval without endangering the entire system of values which linked individual incentive with social rewards and punishments. Whenever these limits were approached, it would be far safer to channel benevolent emotions toward remote symbols of suffering and exploitation, which would provide a secure ground for testing and developing new attitudes. As soon as the rationalizations were stripped away, the African trade and colonial plantation presented heightened analogies to the most disturbing trends in Britain, such as the uprooting of peasants, the separation of families, absentee ownership, and the systematizing of work discipline. The slave system could stand for the insecurity and mobility of labor in a profit oriented society. And yet, the injustice of slavery could be identified with individuals rather than with impersonal forces. And whatever hardships the Negro might suffer, he was free from the guilt of economic failure. His emancipation would not be like the elevation of a worker to an undeserved station. It would substitute the fear of hunger for the fear of the whip. And according to the Reverend Joseph Townsend, who defended laissez-faire at the very moment British abolitionism was gaining momentum, hunger was the most quote unquote natural motive to industry. The poor laws, said Townsend, were founded on the principle of slavery. Then, too, freedom would open the worker's soul to those inner controls and moral restraints which were, according to Hannah More and the Reverend Thomas Malthus, essential to industry and social subordination. We might conjecture that anti-slavery performed the dual function of associating inhumanity with a pre-capitalistic system and of displacing fears and emotions engendered by the vast social changes of the 18th century. This would not mean that the problem of slavery was less real than any other, or that the response of abolitionists was essentially irrational. The central question is, what led men to see the problem? But when one considers the broader implications of the subject and perceives the anti-slavery movement as one of the first modern testing grounds of Christianity, as a vital bridge from the saving of souls to the quest for social justice, it becomes apparent that we must first look more deeply into sources of religious transformation, for there would have been no need or inclination to see the Negro slave as a symbol of dehumanization if the British Protestants had continued to believe that natural man was totally corrupt, that suffering and subordination were necessary parts of life, and that the only true freedom lay in salvation from the world. Interesting, this was written in 1967, and he's using the term social justice, though I don't think he means the same thing as people do nowadays. Although many English Protestants of the early 17th century accepted Calvin's grim views on predestination, as well as Luther's treatise on the enslaved will, they adhered to a number of beliefs that were to become essential ingredients of the anti-slavery mind. Puritanism was strongly tinged with the sectarian sense of moral self-assurance. If the majority of men were condemned to sin and were incapable of moral freedom, the saints might know God in their hearts and live by a higher law. Quote, this infallible assurance, writes N. H. Fairchild, could easily become identified with the inner light of the antinomian enthusiast, the universal reason of the rationalists, the natural goodness of the sentimentalists. End quote. It could also provide a basis for judging the immoral compromises in human laws and institutions, and if saints enjoyed spiritual equality and their outward acts were but reflections of an inward purity, external distinctions were of limited and temporary importance. A white soul might be found in the blackest body. Conversely, there were no kings, judges, or masters who might not be corrupted by self-will or led to abuse their power, though British Protestants accepted the ancient belief that women were destined to live as perpetual to lives of perpetual inferiority and subordination. They pictured marriage as a contractual relationship which imposed limits on the arbitrary power of husbands. Such suspicion of unlimited power, indifference toward external distinctions, and faith in individual moral judgment were not diminished by the turmoil of the civil wars and a growing desire for toleration and social harmony. We have already presented Richard Baxter as a leading exponent of the Christianization of Negro slavery. In one sense, his view of the subject was thoroughly conventional and differed little from the position of Catholic writers of the previous century. Never doubting that slavery was a legitimate consequence of war, crime, or poverty, he urged masters to be merciful and to accept the obligation of guarding their slaves' souls. Baxter's ideals of limited power and moral trusteeship were ultimately adopted by the Church of England and were even embodied in colonial law. But slavery, as we have seen, continued to be slavery. There was, however, another side to Richard Baxter. A Christian directory, written in 1664 and 65, was designed to bring theology down to earth and to show the practical consequences of particular beliefs. Baxter knew how slaves were obtained in Africa, and he called their procurers the quote, common enemies of mankind. End quote. It was a quote unquote heinous sin to buy such bondsmen, except for the purpose of freeing them. Colonial planters who reduced their Negroes to the level of beasts were quote unquote incarnate devils. As Baxter likened British slaveholders to the Spanish conquistadors and interpreted West Indian plagues and hurricanes as deserved retribution, his rhetoric approached the vehemence of the most militant abolitionists. A mild Puritan influenced by the austere William Ames, but also by the moderating doctrines of Benjamin Whichcote, um, or would that just be Wycote? I don't know. Whichcote. I, I could see how that could be Wycote. Anyway, um, Baxter sought, above all, to find a middle course between warring theologies and to distinguish the vital core of Christian morality. He was also eager to vindicate the reputation of British Protestantism, which had been debased by years of civil strife. While mainly concerned with saving the souls of Negro servants, he found that an attack on colonial slavery could be a way of affirming and clarifying traditional values, and of identifying greed and covetousness with an unchristian innovation. This purpose is even more apparent in the writings of Morgan Godwin, whose angry outbursts reveal the intensity of religious strains in the 1680s and provide insights into early sources of anti-slavery sentiment. Godwin, like Baxter, was bitterly opposed to the Quakers, and it was George Fox, quote unquote, an officious friend, who first directed his attention to Negro slavery. When Godwin was visiting Barbados, Fox had given him a pamphlet attacking the Church of England for its refusal to minister to slaves. In the eyes of the good Anglican, this was like Judas being a spokesman for the poor. Since the true church was now threatened not only by its traditional Catholic foe, but by mad Quakers, Commonwealth men, and rank atheists, there could be no delay in self-purification. Indeed, Godwin suspected that the neglect of heathen souls had been the prime cause of creeping infidelity and anti-religious conspiracy. Godwin's crusade against West Indian planters was clearly a way of externalizing religious tensions. This can be seen in his obsession with the purity of faith and in his lack of interest in the Negro. Slavery was of was first of all a model of atheistic mammonism, which had been alarmingly promoted by the discovery and exploitation of America. Troubled by the quickening drive for wealth in England, Godwin saw America as the very source of the heresy that everything profitable was legal, and slavery epitomized the new commercial spirit. The planters agreed all The planters' greed also led to a false idea of liberty and to a materialistic philosophy whose counterparts had already thrown England into turmoil. Whereas Christianity had always supported the absolute authority of rulers and masters, the Americans had insisted that religion would be dangerous for slaves. This betrayed their affinities with the licentious Commonwealth men who confused spiritual liberty with a total freedom from duty and external restraint. And in addition to holding infidel notions of liberty, the slaveholders had blurred distinctions between soul and body, between substance and accident. Slavery, a mere accident, could not affect the soul or alter the substance of manhood. Yet by exaggerating accidental qualities and treating men as mere mechanisms, the Americans had fragmented the essential unity of being. Negro slavery was a paradigm of libertinism, nominalism, and materialism. Moreover, the growing belief in Negro inferiority contained two of the more dangerous threats to true religion. Godwin pointedly observed that while contemporary Englishmen had little stomach for the severe doctrine of reprobation, they were quick to apply it to the supposed posterity of Ham, as if mere men could know and execute God's judgments. More ominous still was the attempt of certain infidels to undermine the Bible by suggesting the separate creation of the Negro race. In Godwin's mind, the West Indian planters and their English allies stood for all the secular, materialistic forces, the subversive notions of political liberty, the religious heterodoxy, and abuse of Scripture, which were destroying the old world of faith, obedience, and contentment. As a defender of imperiled tradition, he assumed the role of a Christian warrior bravely exposing the sins and conspiracies of slaveholders. Like later abolitionists, he made much of his willingness to face censure and persecution in the interest of truth. It is curious that a man who actually upheld the institution of slavery and who demanded no more than the baptism and religious instruction of Negroes should have fallen into so many of the patterns of later anti-slavery thought. This was, one suspects, about as far as traditional Protestant culture could go. There were men who went beyond the positions of Baxter and Godwin, but in these rare cases there is evidence that religious tensions, compounded by personal and social strains, had already brought a subtle transformation in the Protestant worldview. Early in the 17th century, hey, Nambro, how's it going? I just saw you came in. Sorry. I got to look over the glasses to see chat. So, early in the 17th century, a Puritan writer named Paul Baines drew a highly conventional analogy between sin and slavery. Holiness, he wrote, derived neither from good nature nor from moral justice, but rather from a renunciation of the will and a liberation from quote-unquote brutish bondage to the flesh. Men, however, were so evil that they imagined themselves to be free when they were really Satan's slaves and could only be emancipated by Christ's ransom. For Adam's sin had condemned all his posterity to perpetual slavery, and, quote, the children you know of persons in bondage are all bondmen likewise, portus sequitur ventrum, end quote. Although Baines was primarily concerned with the bondage of the human soul, he went on to describe servitude in an expanded edition of his work as, quote, a miserable condition which entereth through sin, end quote. The bodies of slavish servants were, or I assume that's, anyway, sorry. The bodies of Slavish servants were, quote, perpetually put under the power of the master as blackamoors with us, end quote. And though masters were limited by certain duties, their authority was as absolute as that of kings over, quote, the flesh or outward man, end quote. A servant must walk in fear and trembling toward his master. He, quote, must not do his own will, but his master's whom he serveth, end quote. He must obey even an evil master and be silent and humble when punished, knowing that he serves, quote, not man so much as God in man, and the reason of all followeth from God's recompense, end quote. In 1700, Samuel Sewall, the Massachusetts jurist, was inspired by Baines to denounce Negro slavery. Sewall was a good Puritan who should have been no more preoccupied than Baines with the outward conditions of worldly life. He believed in original sin and in the necessity of grace for, quote, bettering men's estates, respecting God and themselves, yet. Yet, he went on, through the indulgence and of God to our first parents after the fall, the outward estate of all and every of their children remains the same as to one another, so that originally and naturally there is no such thing as slavery, end quote. Somehow the traditional Christian distinction between inner and outer states had become blurred, and the effects of sin had all but disappeared. Paul Baines, notwithstanding good nature and moral justice, had assumed some of the aspects of holiness. Before turning to a further analysis of Sewall's writing and the controversy it provoked, it is well to consider the circumstances which must have influenced his thought. In the first place, Massachusetts in 1700 was receiving a rather sudden influx of Negro slaves. Even John Saffin, Sewall's pro-slavery opponent, admitted that this was undesirable, since white servants were infinitely preferable. The Boston Newsletter would soon point with alarm at Negro crime and disorder, and there was a flurry of agitation for regulatory laws and restrictions on importation. We have already seen how Cotton Mather tried to use conversion as an instrument of social control. It is doubtful, however, whether a modest increase in Negro slaves would have provoked moral protest if Massachusetts had not been, like Pennsylvania, in the grip of severe religious and cultural tensions. Perry Miller has said that if one begins with the original New England conception of a unified culture, quote, what happened between 1698 and 1701 would seem a convergence of devilish and disruptive forces beyond the ability of man to subdue, end quote. On the frontier, Solomon Stoddard openly defied traditional rules confining church membership to the visible saints. In Boston itself, prosperous merchants founded a new church where Benjamin Coleman, fresh from England in 1700, preached a tolerant, reassuring religion in the elegant style of the English. Quote, quote unquote, men of latitude. In Harvard, the very seat of Puritan learning, the Mather dynasty was further undetermined by the introduction of Descartes and a new spirit of religious rationalism. The older leaders, such as Samuel Sewall, looked on with anguish as their holy commonwealth fell apart. In his Phenomena Quadam Apocalyptica, written in 1697, Sewell had celebrated America as the theater of a cosmic moral drama. He was convinced of the superiority of the American environment and imagined that the New World had been a virtual Garden of Eden at the time of discovery. But from Las Casas, he had learned that paradise could be the scene of the most dreadful sins and retributions. In America, the consequences of vice and virtue were magnified, and it was there that the Antichrist would make his final stand. Such beliefs, which entailed an awesome sense of personal responsibility, gave an added poignancy to Sewell's own tragedy. He had been in 1692 one of the judges of the court of Oyer and Terminer, which had condemned the Salem witches. This grisly affair, as Perry Miller has remarked, gradually ate into the New England conscience. Sewell publicly confessed his guilt in 1697 and asked for pardon. He knew that his sins had been responsible for the deaths and afflictions of his family and friends, which continued through the decade. God's controversy with New England was amply illustrated by a succession of bad harvests and the prolonged war in Europe. Samuel Sewell needed no further proofs that public opinion, as well as the best of men, could be grievously wrong. In June of 1700, when Sewell was pondering Paul Baines, quote, "In came Brother Belknap to show me a petition he intended to present for the freeing a Negro and his wife who were unjustly held in bondage." End quote. It seemed probable that this slave was named Adam and belonged to John Saffin, a prosperous merchant, landowner, and former deputy to the General Court. In 1694, Saffin had decided to place Adam in the employment of a tenant farmer and had written an instrument to free the Negro in 7 years if he proved obedient and industrious. The tenant, however, claimed that Adam was insolent and even dangerous, and gave him back to Saffin. After further disciplinary troubles, Adam demanded his freedom and told Saffin, quote, "in a saucy and surly manner, that I must go to Captain Sewell." End quote. Judge Sewell upheld Adam's claim and rebuked Saffin, who was obviously not pleased and who marshaled all his political power for battle. Since Saffin was at times a judge himself, the contest was long and bitter. Sewell accused him of jury tampering, but toward the end of 1703 the Superior Court, of which Sewell was one of the 4 justices, declared that Adam was free. Meanwhile, on June 24, 1700, Sewell had published his famous tract, The Selling of Joseph, which was answered by Saffin the following year, emphasizing that all men were sons of Adam, and he seemed to play upon the name. Sewell went on to develop Bain's argument, taken from the Epistle of Paul to the Ephesians, that Christ had broken the wall of partition between Jews and Gentiles and had united all men under the law of love. At moments he was more eloquent than Godwin or Baxter. Quote, "There is no proportion between 20 pieces of silver and liberty. The commodity itself is the claimer." End quote. And yet the most striking characteristic of Sewell's writing was its mood of doubt and uncertainty. The judge of the Salem witches shrank from being, quote, "executioner of the vindictive wrath of God." End quote. For New England Puritans, the Bible was presumably a clear and authoritative guide, but Sewell wondered whether the curse of Canaan was now out of date, or whether there had been a misreading of the original text. Such questions might easily be pursued to the conclusions of men like John Locke and John Toland. Sewell also had doubts on the legitimacy of African wars and enslavement. He suspected that holiness was, quote unquote, rarely engraven on this kind of servitude, and yet he knew that few of his countrymen would accept the emancipation of Negroes, for, quote, "indeed they can seldom use their freedom well." End quote. Racial difference would be an added threat to the unity of Puritan culture. Quote, they can never embody with us and grow up into orderly families to the peopling of the land, but still remain in our body politic as a kind of extravasate blood. End quote. The only solution Sewall suggested was to stop the further importation of slaves. John Safin took advantage of Sewall's equivocations and exposed the latent subversiveness of his arguments, but ignoring biblical sanctions for perpetual slavery and by falsely invoking the Hebrews' rules against selling their own brethren, Sewall had, in effect, undermined the authority of Scripture. While carefully conceding that not all slavery was unlawful, he consistently called the sons of Adam co-heirs with equal rights to liberty, love, and respect. Co-heirs, sorry. Um, this was to challenge the entire structure of orders and degrees which God had established for men. For if kings and slaves had equal rights in liberty and respect, God's quote unquote ordinary providences in governing the world were clearly unjust and wrong. Sewall was then well on the road to blasphemy and infidelity. But even Safin sensed that the ancient theory of fixed social orders could not be pushed too far. What was proper for captive heathens was not necessarily proper for European Christians. Africans, he hinted, were really unfit for freedom, and since it would be difficult to remove them from the country, they would have to remain as slaves. For although all their violent conflict in principle, Sewall and Safin were remarkably close in their conviction that Negro slavery was undesirable, but that emancipation and racial integration would be disastrous. What distinguished Samuel Sewall was a conscience sensitized to human injustice and to the woeful fate of an unrepentant America. The fact that his protest was a single shot affair suggests that his concern was the product of a critical and temporary convergence of pressures in which plea and the plea of the enslaved Adam was a catalyzing agent. Weary of contention on a number of other fronts, Sewall soon wrote a friend that he had declined to trouble the province with a reply to John Safin. He had already contributed, however, to an intercolonial and transatlantic transmission of ideas which faintly anticipated the later exchanges of Benezet, Sharp, and Wesley. It is doubtful whether Benjamin Lay had many readers, but the intrepid little Quaker embedded the selling of Joseph within his own wild prose. As we have seen, John Hepburn reprinted material from a pamphlet, The Athenian Oracle, which Sewall had published in 1705. The Athenian Oracle was actually an English periodical edited by John Dunton, an eccentric bookseller and publisher who had ties with the literary world of Swift and Defoe, and who was aided as editor by his brother-in-law Samuel Wesley, the father of the great Methodist. It is possible that Dunton had met Sewall in 1685 when he had visited Boston on a bookselling trip and had acquired a high respect for John Eliot. But it is difficult to imagine the Puritan fathers warming to a man who made studies of London prostitutes and whose Athenian society was dedicated to the rebirth of ancient civilization. The Athenian Oracle was a curious blend of rational analysis, sentimentalism, and sensationalism, and in its exploitation of the device of startling questions and glib answers was not unlike the popular advice columns in modern newspapers. Its readers were enlightened on such fascinating questions as, was Adam a giant? And can a man commit adultery with his own wife? Some insubstantial evidence suggests that Sewall may have written to Dunton at the time of the legal controversy with Safin, asking whether the slave trade was unlawful in itself. In an event in December 1705, Sewall was browsing in a bookshop and discovered the oracle's answer to his question, which he immediately asked Bartholomew Green to reprint as an anonymous reply to John Saffin. This piece was considerably stronger than Sewall's own pamphlet. It branded the slave trade as a sin against the very laws of nature and specifically answered 6 pro-slavery arguments. Thinking perhaps of the recent case of Chamberlain versus Harvey, the author held that as soon as an infidel was baptized in England, he enjoyed equal protection of the laws. He praised New England for its success in Christianizing Indians and said that there is not for that were it not for the slave trade, similar results might have been achieved in Africa. This gesture of goodwill toward the Puritans did not prevent the pamphlet from bringing frowns and hard words in Boston. But consistency was not one of Dunton's virtues, and if John Saffin had cared, he could have reprinted his own oracle in the same edition which Sewall had used. The editor considered. Wait a minute. I'm sorry. That sentence is really. In the same edition which Sewall had used, the editor considered the obligation of colonial masters to baptize their slaves, and here he defended all the arguments that the other essay had refuted. Baptism had no effect on man's civil state. Some nations, such as the barbarous Africans, seemed to be born for slavery and had known no other condition throughout history, and they certainly fared much better as the slaves of Christians than as cutthroats and cannibals at home. Quote, especially when by the slavery of their bodies they are brought to a capacity of freeing their souls from a much more unsupportable bondage. End quote. John Saffin could have asked for no more. I'm going to just quickly see how much further do we have in this chapter. I'm going to decide whether I need to take a break. Holy moly. Okay. So we have 16 pages to go. Let's just plow on. While Samuel Sewall did little more than raise doubts and questions, he wrote at a time of great cultural transformation in the English-speaking world. The growth of anti-slavery thought, as the pioneering work of Wiley Cypher has shown, was dependent upon the emergence of a new ethic of benevolence. It is a mistake, however, to picture this momentous shift in values as a secular movement originating with Shaftesbury and Francis Hutcheson. The philosophy of benevolence was a product of the 17th century, when certain British Protestants, shaken by theological controversy and the implications of modern science, seemed increasingly to human nature and conduct as a basis for faith. In their impatience with theological dogma, their distaste for the doctrine of original sin, their appreciation for human feeling and sentiment, and their confidence in a man's capacity for moral improvement, these latitudinarians, as they were called, anticipated the main concerns of the Enlightenment and laid an indispensable foundation for social reform. Interest in English Puritanism has often diverted attention from a liberal tradition that runs from the natural philosophers of the Italian Renaissance, from the Neoplatonism of the Florentine Academy, through John Colet, Erasmus, Thomas More, and finally Benjamin Wycott. That's that one I couldn't decide on the pronunciation of before, who brought to Emmanuel College the very citadel of Puritanism, a religion of sweetness and light. Even before the Pilgrim Fathers had departed from Holland, other Englishmen had been stirred by the hopeful doctrines of the Dutch Arminians, and had, like John Hales, quote, bid Calvin good night, end quote. These men not only shook off beliefs in predestination and total depravity, but began to think of redemption as a historical process in which man gradually came to know and live by the laws of eternal reason. It was possible, they believed, to break through the barriers which had separated the depraved present from the sacred past and the estranged soul from the harmonies of universal being. There was no need for conflict between religion and humanistic philosophy, since true religion was not a set of beliefs or prescribed ceremonies, but a way of life and a new relationship with the world. The basic assumption was nourished by a reaction to Puritanism and religious war and passed from Wycott and the Cambridge Platonists to the most influential clergymen of the Church of England. In 1663, Henry More claimed that the majority of English divines had become Arminians. Within a generation, the church would be dominated by men who preached of reason and human ability, whose quote unquote notions of morality, as was said at the funeral sermon of Archbishop John Tillotson, quote, were fine and sublime, end quote, and who were religious without, again, quote, affectation, bigotry, or superstition, end quote. I hate it when they do it that way. Just give me the whole quote, man. Such a thorough repudiation of Calvinism was bound to change beliefs about nature and the meaning of evil. According to Benjamin Wycott, quote, nothing of the natural state is base or vile, end quote. Man was alone responsible for his alienation from God and could at any time achieve reunion. Quote, for a man cannot open his eye nor lend his ear, but everything will declare more or less of God, end quote. In France, Diderot would later give the same thought a sharper edge. Quote, liberate God, see him everywhere where he actually is, or else say that he does not exist at all, end quote. But in England there was no cause for such a defiant tone. Revealed religion did not seem threatened by saying that heaven was a quote unquote temper of spirit before it was a place, that the soul of man was quote the candle of the Lord, end quote, or a quote little metal of God, end quote. And yet the bland optimism of the men of latitude reactivated an ancient problem. If right and wrong were defined by the eternal order of nature and not by God's inscrutable will, if human reason was a divine light that provided access to moral truth and to immediate union with the good, then what was evil? Perhaps, after all, the apparent opposition between grace and nature was only a result of distorted perception. Seen in the proper light, everything had a place and function, and it was really the best of all possible worlds. On the other hand, if one could find an ideal in nature from which a portion of mankind had fallen, there would still be a ground for discontent and aspiration. When the latitudinarian clergy became disturbed by the vices and luxuries of Restoration England, they turned to more primitive societies for models of natural virtue. Their efforts to bridge the gap between human reason and nature came at a time when Europe was still engaged in the self-discovery that accompanies the discovery of different races and cultures. What was the meaning of the astounding diversity in human laws and customs? Were hundreds of millions of heathen living in a state of perdition through ignorance of the gospel, or were they enjoying a natural felicity which had long been lost to Europe? As 17th century Europeans pondered Virgil's Georgics and Horace's Odes and Epodes, they found striking parallels between primitive life and the classic pastoral tradition. Here surely was an answer to the senseless struggles over religious dogma and to the spirit of greed which had led to plunder and a ruthless pursuit of wealth. For beneath a superficial diversity of cultures, one might find a universal capacity for happiness and contentment, so long as man's natural faculties had not been perverted by error and artificial desire. We must look to primitive man, said Benjamin Wycott, if we would seek man's moral sense in its pristine state. Natural law, said Nathaniel Culverwell, is truly recognized and practiced only by men who have escaped the corruptions of civilization. If traditionalists objected that savages were ignorant of the gospel, the answer was that heathen might carry within them the true spirit of Christ, and hence be better Christians than hypocrites who knew and professed all the articles of faith. This primitivistic strain in English theology was always balanced by a respect for common sense and civilized manners. I that last statement before this started, how the heathen might carry within them the true spirit of Christ and hence be better Christians, um, reminds me of something I saw. It's I know somebody's going to be mad that I used the term Eskimo, but I'm going to use it anyway. There's this old Eskimo man, and he goes to the local the local missionary, and he asks him whether or not God would have condemned him to hell um, before he knew anything about God in the Bible. And the missionary says, "No, he would, of course not." And then the Eskimo says, "Then why did you tell me?" So to me, that's sort of the same kind of thinking. Is if they were ignorant and they were better Christians than the aware, then why tell them? Leave them alone, which was the old man's point. Anyway, it just reminded me of that. This primitivistic strain in English theology was always balanced by a respect for common sense and civilized manners. It did not, as in France, play into the hands of enemies of religion and social inequality. But if Baron de Lahontan could picture a Huron sage proclaiming that all Europeans were slaves and that private property was the source of their ills, John Dennis could write an immensely popular play in 1704 in which a noble savage symbolized the natural love of liberty and denounced the French as despicable slaves. More significant was the way in which primitivism reinforced Christian asceticism and provided a means for discharging anxieties generated by commercial prosperity. Poets like James Thomson, who reflected much of the spirit of latitudinarian theology, tended to celebrate economic progress and especially commercial expansion, which they associated with the beneficent laws of Newtonian science. But they were also enchanted by the swains and bowers of the pastoral tradition, by the simple innocence of children and untutored men, by the serenity of the Golden Age. It was essential to keep commercial greatness distinct from false refinements, self-seeking, and artificial cravings, which brought the degeneracy and fall of nations. Defoe, who created the most memorable picture of the sufficiency of simple life, classed the African trade with whoring and drunkenness in his Reformation of Manners. Quote, the harmless natives basely they trepan, and barter baubles for the souls of men. The wretches they to Christian climes bring o'er, to serve worse heathens than they did before. End quote. The cruelties and debaucheries of American slavery were a reproach to Christianity. The despairing slaves, quote, look for famines, plagues, disease, and death, blasts from above, and earthquakes from beneath. But when they see, regardless, heaven looks on, they curse our gods or think that we have none, end quote. Yet retributive justice could be as much a part of nature as of God. In Thomson's vivid image, a shark following a ship, quote, of that cruel trade, which spoils unhappy Guinea of her sons, demands his share of prey, end quote. And when a storm dashes the ship to pieces, the shark riots in a quote unquote vengeful meal of tyrants and slaves. Neither Thomson nor Defoe had any thought of becoming abolitionists, but they represented a tendency which would become far more apparent in sermons and literature of the mid-18th century, to associate luxury, corruption, and materialism with certain kinds of quote-unquote unnatural commerce. It may appear that the latitudinarian clergy pointed the way to secular rationalism. Their humanistic leanings made them trust reason above tradition. The new Cartesian philosophy was embraced by Dutch Arminians and was spread in England by Henry More. Like Hobbes, the liberal clergy looked for first principles in the nature of man, and subjected Scripture to rational standards of interpretation which would have horrified Samuel Sewall. Tillotson used arguments against transubstantiation, which Hume would later turn against all miracles. And when Newton uncovered the secrets of the heavens and Locke deduced the attributes of God from man's idea of himself, it remained for only it remained only for divines like Samuel Clarke to show that religion, like any other science, was a rational system of propositions. But despite such confidence in the reasonableness of both Christianity and the universe, there was a growing shadow of doubt which was crucial for the development of the philosophy of benevolence and indeed for the entire Romantic movement. Even in the 17th century, a few men began to sense the point which Shelley made when he said that science, enlarging the empire of man over the external world, quote, proportionately circumscribed those of the internal world, and man, having enslaved the elements, remains himself a slave. End quote. If humanists and latitudinarians had narrowed the cleavage between the realms of nature and grace, Descartes, as his Arminian supporters were to discover, had unleashed new sources of despair by severing the human soul from a mechanistic world of motion and substance. Long before the emergence of Romanticism, religious poets like Edward Young, who were greatly admired by later evangelical reformers, experienced a dread of meaninglessness in an inanimate world, and turned inward to the feelings and passions to find the voice of eternity. The actual world was cold and colorless, and man was thrown back upon himself. Quote, helpless immortal, insect infinite, a worm, a god. I tremble at myself, and in myself am lost, at home a stranger. End quote. It was Thomas Hobbes who largely turned the attention of British theologians to man's capacity for subjective feeling. Philip Jacob Spener, the German pietist, won his master's degree by disputing Hobbes. Wyckoff, Isaac Barrow, Henry More, Tillotson, and a host of others joined the crusade against the great symbol of atheism. The most shocking thing about Hobbes was his contention that man was nothing but an engine of egoism, dominated by fear, greed, and lust. Divines who had rebelled against Calvin's conceptions of man's depravity and God's unlimited sovereignty were even more outraged by this secular philosophy, which identified law with the will of a worldly sovereign and held that man's only salvation lay in his becoming a slave to the state. The way to counter Hobbes was to show that men were not discrete particles of self-interest, requiring for harmonious union a coercive external will. Quote, nature has endued us, said Knightley Chetwood, with the tenderest passions. We are all counterparts one of another. The doleful cry of one in extreme distress makes the strings to tremble at our very hearts." End quote. Hobbes had ignored man's capacity for moral feeling. His instinctive responses of sympathy, approbation, and disapproval, which had nothing to do with calculated self-interest. Intellect, according to Henry Moore, could apprehend goodness, but only the quote-unquote boniform faculty could taste its sweetness. Before the end of the 17th century, the idea of an inherent moral sense had become a commonplace in English sermons. But to say that doing good was rewarded by a, quote, delicious relish upon the mind, end quote, or by, quote, a sort of pleasing anguish that sweetly melts the mind and terminates in a self-approving joy, end quote, was to be as hedonistic as Hobbes. And as Shaftesbury was to show, the cultivation of sensibility could become an exclusive affair confined to men of aristocratic tastes. It is true that as early as the 1670s, Isaac Barrow and Richard Cumberland were emphasizing that the subjective pleasure of the spectator was not enough. Like grace, the moral sensibility was inseparable from social duty. If man was, in a sense, justified by his benevolent soul, and hence cleared from the accusations of Hobbes, his nobility must find expression in useful works. The public welfare was served by such individuals' quote-unquote self-approving joy. But this utilitarian argument again seemed to lead toward the enemy's position of fusing private and public interests, and it was opposed to the inclinations toward introspection and self-cultivation, which were so much a part of the latitudinarian temper. The quote-unquote man of feeling would long be torn between the ideal of meditative passivity and an ultimate need to make disinterested contact with the bewildering world of cause and effect. The posture of the sensitive spectator was encouraged by a new literary mode which was closely related to latitudinarian religion. In 1696, Cully Cibber's, Cibber, Love's Last Shift began its half-century of success on the English stage, and instead of laughing at the plight of fools or rejoicing in the fate of villains, audiences learned to weep over the misfortunes of the innocent. While the sentimental drama made slow headway against the reigning style of neoclassicism, it enjoyed increasing popularity by the 1720s and was a prevailing vogue by the 1760s. Poets, novelists, and essayists paid homage to the cult of sensibility. The result of their collective efforts was a profound though immeasurable transformation in public values. H. N. Fairchild has maintained that sentimentalism in religion and literature was a single movement whose psychological root was a repudiation of sin and an expansion of the ego. The Christian has lost most of his faith, but, quote, he retains in a blurred and softened form the emotions which his creed hath both reflected and fostered. The God above him becomes more shadowy than the God within him, until at last he is left with the basic attitude of sentimentalism, a sense of inward virtue and freedom which must somehow find corroboration in the nature of the universe. Just enough brimstone remains to tinge his optimism with melancholy, just enough otherworldliness to make him shrink at times from the civilization which he has built. End quote. The dominant characteristic of the new literature was a juxtaposition of two opposing worlds of value. The world of sin was hard-boiled, cynical, self-seeking, licentious, and wholly preoccupied with luxury and power. The world of virtue rested on human relationships and sympathy and genuine emotion. And since the moral faculty was often associated with man's original innocence, and was increasingly conceived as something independent of reason and civilization, one might achieve a sense of communion with universal goodness by sympathizing with the moral feeling of a primitive subject. The ideal, perhaps, was discovered by Herbert Croft in 1776 when he had the "luxury" of watching a Negro stop on a London street and give 3 halfpence and a farthing, "his little all," to a weeping sailor with one arm and 2 wooden legs. By this time the suffering of Negro slaves had become a popular theme in verse and drama, and within a decade the heartless master and lamenting slave would be accepted as conventional symbols of the two worlds of value. No doubt this flood of anti-slavery literature conditioned many people to an active support of abolition, and attitudes which had first been learned in the theater or in an idle hour of reading were transferred to the grim stage of reality. Nevertheless, there was an immense gulf between literary pathos and dedicated reform, between the ideal of moral refinement and a willingness to liberate the uncultivated forces of nature. Hannah More, who used the plight of slaves to soften the hearts of women of rank, preached a different morality in her Tales for the Common People. Pause, drink. But the distance between spectator and actor was somewhat narrowed by the theory of the sublime. Interest in the sublime developed concurrently with interest in the moral sense. Boileau's revival of Longinus coincided with the sermons of latitudinarians on man's natural sense of virtue. The writings of John Dennis on sublime overlapped Shaftesbury's inquiry concerning virtue or merit. Burke's treatise on the sublime followed by 2 years the publication of Hutchinson's System of Moral Philosophy. And like the moral sense, man's response to the sublime was subjective, non-intellectual, and was supposedly derived from inborn taste and emotion. In Dennis's words, sublimity evoked, quote, "a delightful horror, a terrible joy," end quote. These powerful emotions might arise from a direct confrontation with nature in its most frightening manifestations, such as storms, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions, but it was essential that the fear of pain and death be mitigated by a sense of personal security, since terror, as Burke put it, quote, "is a passion which always produces delight when it does not press too close, and pity is a passion accompanied with pleasure because it arises from love and social affection," end quote. In other words, the Creator had implanted in man a capacity for delighting in, quote, "the real misfortunes and pains of others," end quote. And it was this pleasure which made benevolence possible, for, quote, "if this passion was simply painful, we would shun with the greatest care all persons and places that could excite such a passion, as some who are so far gone in indolence as not to endure any strong impression actually do," end quote. Okay. So we're on 358. I think it was 364. Yeah, 364. So 6 pages. Religious subjects were said to evoke the loftiest emotions, and indeed the cult of the sublime has aptly been called, quote, "a sort of Methodist revival in art," end quote. There would appear to be more than a tenuous connection between the terrifying images in Jonathan Edwards' sermons, which were designed to strike through the senses of the most indolent of sinners, and the succession of tempests, corpses, and beasts of prey in the works of Thomson and Savage. John Wesley would not have believed that any true Christian could delight in the sufferings of others, let alone that such delight could serve as a basis for compassion. But in his Thoughts upon Slavery, he made effective use of images of the most sadistic torture, and slavery, in fact, conformed almost perfectly to Burke's requirements for the sublime. Where else could pain and death be found on so vast a scale, from the bloody wars which drove innocent men from their Eden-like garden, from the fateful crossing of the Atlantic Styx, to the Dantesque horrors of the colonial plantation, and it was all as remote as the deist's God, though far more terrifying. The response to slavery, then, could be disinterested, since the pain did not press too close. In the final analysis, it was the response itself that counted for sublimity, as Longinus had said, quote, is the echo of a great soul, end quote. Yet slavery was, quote unquote, the prison of the soul, which extinguished all that was noble in the human mind. England would never be so thrilled by the struggling African as by the man who descended from exalted rank to plead his cause. Virtue signaling. The trends we have been describing can be interpreted as reactions to religious controversy, decaying faith, and the hard-boiled realism and sophistication of England's ruling classes in the age of Walpole. By the early 18th century, the aristocracy was strongly tinged with skepticism, which reinforced a traditional distaste for religious enthusiasm and nonconformity. Men like John Sheffield, Earl of Mulgrave, easily reconciled a Hobbesian materialism with support of the High Church party, and through the century the boldest wits and scoffers would be good Tories. It was Lord Macclesfield's friend, Bernard de Mandeville, who took up Hobbes's role of shocking public opinion, and who maintained that benevolence was a sham, that men were and should be self-interested, and that private vices were public benefits. The 1723 edition of Mandeville's Fables of the Bees brought a much wider appreciation of his opponent, Shaftesbury, who had earlier popularized and developed the moral insights of the Cambridge Platonists. The belief in man's natural benevolence won its way in England as an answer to infidelity. Even the Orthodox clergy who mounted... Wow. Glad we're getting almost done. I'm starting to really falter here. Even the Orthodox clergy, who mounted an overwhelming offensive against the challenge of deism, found themselves compelled to convince the reading public of the morality or reasonableness of revelation. By the 1730s, when the battle subsided, mystery and emotion had virtually been drained from English theology. God was to be known God was to be known chiefly through the amazing ingenuity of his works. The best religion was that which promoted a moral life. It contrast marked contrast to France. Religion in England absorbed and softened much of the rationalist attack, and out of the latitudinarian past, encouraged by the great Whig families, there emerged in both the established and dissenting churches a kind of pragmatic middle way, which found proof of the moral order of creation in man's capacity for virtue, liberty, and happiness. The architects of this compromise such as Francis Hutcheson and James Foster, shifted attention from man's necessary subjection to the will of God to his natural place in a harmonious and benevolent universe. And these same writers, as we shall see, were also the first to give anti-slavery a basis in moral philosophy. But secularization did not necessarily lead toward humanitarian reform. The great moral crisis of the 18th century, which preoccupied the keenest minds from Leibniz and Voltaire to Jonathan Edwards, revolved around two related points. First, the triumph of reason appeared to have liberated man from enslavement to original sin. But as philosophers pursued the implications of Lockean psychology, it seemed that man was imprisoned within the walls of sensory experience and subjected to the tyranny of pleasure and pain. Hume's conclusion was that reason, quote, is and only ought to be the slave of the passions, end quote. As we have seen, one might try to ennoble pleasure by associating it with an instinctive and disinterested response to suffering. But a second problem was implicit in the view that man's tender passions were part of the universal harmony of creation. For if nature was a unified whole and conformed to invariable laws, as Newtonian science had shown, and if nature was not a dark and soulless mechanism, then human suffering must serve a necessary moral function. Evil, as William King and numerous divines maintained, was simply a privation of perfection. It was part of the necessary plenitude of the best of all possible worlds. The idea was popularized by Pope, who would not, however, quite decide whether the world was a harmonious chain of being or a brutal arena where, quote, all subsists by elemental strife, end quote. But Soame, Soame, Soame Genians had no doubt, quote, that the sufferings of individuals were absolutely necessary to universal happiness, end quote, or that, quote, the universe is a system whose very essence consists in subordination, a scale of beings descending by insensible degrees from infinite perfection to absolute nothing, in which the beauty and happiness of the whole depend altogether on the just inferiority of its parts, that is, on the comparative imperfections of the several beings of which it is composed, end quote. As an alternative to this self-justifying universe, one might accept William Waterland's tough and self-justifying God, who sanctioned lying, cheating, death, and slavery whenever he pleased, and whose standards were not to be measured by sentimental men. But either way, the reformer must focus his energies on individual moral failings and not tamper with the ordained structure of things. And yet Christian morality had always depended upon a sense of incompleteness, upon a tension between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. If deists were horrified by the barbarities of the Old Testament, which Waterland was so eager to justify, Joseph Butler was prepared to show that nature itself was no more humane. The talk of nicely balanced forces of perfection and imperfection, of suffering and happiness, was sheer illusion. The world was so full of misery and injustice that only an afterlife could possibly redress the imbalance. There was, however, another answer to Butler's frank realism. Some of the early latitudinarians had held that men could only gradually understand the full meaning of God's revealed law. The moral sense, like the seed of a flower, grew slowly to fruition. In response to the deists' arguments that Christianity was as old as creation, and that nature was always governed by the same laws, Anglican clergymen began to find began to find in the idea of moral progress a substitute for revelation. They believed, to be sure, in a fixed and eternal law, but it was a law revealed to man only in successive stages. Hence, most of the ordinances of the Old Testament were marks of a primitive age, when the moral sense was still in an undeveloped state. As King in the numerous theodicies had said, evil was necessary for the existence of good, but as the chain of being was stretched out on a frame of time, the imperfections faded slowly into the past. From the 1740s to the 1760s, Anglican apologists met the true crucial problems of the age, the sanction for moral judgment in a Lockean psychology, and the meaning of evil in a Newtonian universe. By merging natural benevolence with a theology of historical progress, by the 1780s, the Reverend James Ramsay, who had done much to promote the cause of anti-slavery, would write that human nature had progressed so far that the average peasant was morally superior to the ancient Greek philosophers. This progress, moreover, had been largely due to the abolition of European slavery, and when Negroes in the colonies were finally emancipated, the way would be open to the fabulous golden age when mutual wants and mutual good will and shall bind all mankind to one common interest. End quote. It is hardly conceivable that anti-slavery could have become a powerful international force had it not been preceded by a revolutionary shift in attitudes towards sin, human nature, and progress. And for England and the English colonies, it was of the utmost importance that these new values and attitudes had religious origins and were linked with a reformulation of Christian belief in the face of science and skepticism. Humanitarian reform provided a means of avoiding doubt and the fear of meaninglessness. To an abstract and lifeless theology, it brought fresh symbols and the opportunity for dedicated action. In an era of sterile controversy over the nature of evil, one might well ask, quote, if slavery is not evil, what is? End quote. In an era of fruitless debate over virtue and self-interest, one might prove that benevolent affections and social utility were not incompatible. Even self-approving joy must be disinterested if the object of philanthropy was the distant and alien Negro. And as the cultivation of sensibility moved from the literary realm to the promotion of human happiness, man's capacity for feeling lost is subjective. Uh, what? Sorry. As the cultivation of sensibility moved from the literary realm to the promotion of human happiness, man's capacity for feeling lost its subjective private character and became a basis for social communication and consensus. Men of different faiths in different parts of the world could share hopes and emotions and feel united in an ennobling cause. They could transform an abstract belief in progress into a plan for action, and at the same time reconcile the ideal of primitive simplicity with the ideal of civilized refinement. The Negro's enslavement, unlike legitimate restraints of society, was not occasioned by sin or necessity. It was wholly undeserved. The Negro represented innocent nature, and hence corresponded psychologically with natural and spontaneous impulses of the reformer. Accordingly, the key to progress lay in the controlled emancipation of innocent nature as found both in the objective slave and in the subjective affections of the reformer. The latter's compassion would evoke compassion in the slave, and the reciprocal love would slowly free the world from corruption and self-seeking. Above all, this regenerative process would not endanger piety or social order. There would be no vengeful assault of nature upon civilization. The slave would simply be lifted to the level of independent action and social obligation. The reformer would achieve freedom from the tyranny of self-interest by merging his soul in a transcendent cause. Philanthropy, as the abolitionist William Allen was to write, made a religion meaningful to ordinary people, gave proof through human action of God's benevolent purposes, and conveyed deep joys which were a foretaste of paradise. We made it. The last few pages were rough, I know. My voice is starting to go a little bit, and I was definitely faltering, but that is why I only do one chapter a night, and hopefully not super long ones. So that we will leave off there. That puts us at chapter 12. I believe there are 14 altogether. Let's see. 14, maybe 15. 15. Yeah, 15 and an epilogue. So, and that'll put us on 12. So we've got 4 more reading sessions in this book. So if you haven't yet, go on Twitter, look me up under the same name, and vote on the next book. I put up 4 there. Can I remember what they all are? The Occult, A History by Colin Wilson. Isis Unveiled by H.P. Blavatsky. The Time Travel Handbook, which is going to be kind of a fun, silly little read. That's by David Hatcher Childress. And then what was my 4th one? The Esoteric Orders and Their Work by Dion Fortune. So any of those would be good. Isis Unveiled is by far the longest, followed by the Occult History, followed by the Time Travel Handbook, and then finally the Esoteric Orders and Their Work. So depends on what length the book. If everybody keeps voting for the Time Travel Handbook, which is so far, no, it's neck and neck. The Occult History has 40% of the votes, and Time Travel Handbook has 40% of the votes, followed by Esoteric Orders. Isis Unveiled has not gotten any votes. So one of the longest and both of the shortest have gotten the votes so far. So get out there and vote. There are only 5 votes, but there are 5 days left. Let me know what y'all think. And feel free to suggest other books that I have not brought up yet. I've got tons and tons of books. I mean, tens of thousands. So the likelihood that you bring something up, that something you bring up is in my library already, is fairly high. So anyway, that is where I will leave this session. I will see you all in the next one. I am going to game tonight. Probably Mass Effect 3. I'm definitely enjoying it more than Force Unleashed. But I'm going to continue with the Force Unleashed too. I think Mass Effect tonight. So I will see you all in a little bit for that session.